Good evening and welcome to tonight's Guardian Live event. For those of you that do use Twitter, we'd love to hear from you during and after the show. Please use hashtag Guardian Live, but do keep your phones on silent. Now, please put your hands together and give a very warm welcome to tonight's guests.
So we've not quite found a way of attaching this yet, so it's like having a saline drip and kind of carrying it around with you.
That makes mine like a colostomy then, because I've got it sort of attached here. Let's actually ignore that. Let's not go there. It's got too medical yet.
Yeah, been there, done that. Welcome everyone in the hall and to everyone who's not in the hall, which I gather is significantly a greater number than the people who are here, and I'm still not used to this fact, which is one of the reasons why when we come to the Q&A, we will be giving equal time to people who are not actually physically present. Actually, it's not wrong because they are physically present, they're just not physically present here. Yeah, anyway, enough of that. Rafael Behr has just published this terrific book, Politics of Survivor's Guide, and then with the surtitle, How to Stay Engaged Without Getting Enraged, and so on. And you may want to ask him whether he shouldn't be enraged, and he will try to tell you why it's actually not very good for you. I first met Rafael when we were both working for The Observer, Rafael. I didn't know at that stage that you'd just been in Russia and done a stint in Russia. I knew nothing back then about your background before that, about your parents who had come from South Africa, and so on. But in many other ways, your kind of background parallels and kind of intertwines with mine. And we've ended up in a kind of sort of roughly the same place, which is in the bruised centre-left over the last few years. And that's one of the reasons why.
We're crouching in the same corner of politics, sort of shivering and whimpering.
So one of the reasons why I enjoyed the book so much was not just because it's very well written, which it is, but also because it kind of speaks to me a lot and is a crystallization of my own experience, but written in a very engaging way, and so on. And also, it is a very wise book, and that doesn't mean it's boring. It's wise without being boring, which is a good kind of wisdom. So, Rafael, let's kind of get straight to it, and so on. There is a conceit which begins the book, but it's actually more than a conceit. It actually kind of acts as almost a reason. I'm going to put it in my way, but you'll then change it, which is actually there came a point at which your body couldn't stand the politics of Britain anymore.
Yeah, that's essentially right. I mean, some people will know, because I've written about it before, that at the end of 2019, shortly after Boris Johnson won that landslide election, and I'm not positing that these two things are immediately connected, but I did have an enormous heart attack. Not a fatal heart attack, spoiler alert, it'll be quite obviously, but it came as a culmination of a period when I'd been feeling incredibly stressed by politics in a very specific way, but in a way that I don't think I'd properly articulated to myself. Now, I mean, there are two very surprising things about a heart attack, two most surprising things about a heart attack. The first one is it's actually incredibly painful. I don't know if anyone's had one. I wouldn't recommend it, but actually it's surprisingly painful. Because it's a cartoonish thing that you've seen performed in media and on TV shows all the time. People touch their chest, and I mustn't do that to the microphone. And they stagger forward like C-3PO, and so when it's actually happening to you, as it did to me, well, this is the second surprising thing, is that it's not happening to someone else. And so at the time, I had this feeling like a sort of volcanic eruption coming out of my chest, and red hot searing pain shooting down the left side of my arm all the way down to my fingertips, and the air being sort of sucked hard out of my lungs, and all the corners of the universe souring in a way that felt like the sort of the apogee of all possible ill-being. And I thought, well, this does feel like just the sort of thing you'd expect to happen if you were having a massive heart attack. But of course, I can't possibly be having a massive heart attack because I've got guests coming for dinner and I've already prepped the salmon. And so really, and then, it's fast forward to being discharged from hospital, having had a massive heart attack, and realizing, okay, so something went on in my relationship with my work and politics, that meant not only had I got into a state of terrible stress, but also I had been in denial about all sorts of things that had been building up before then. And I don't, in the book, I don't, it's not an enormous, elaborate, extended metaphor for the state of politics. It's not sort of politics as cardiology, but it does, the period of sort of enforced recuperation where I thought, if I am going to re-engage and watch Prime Minister's questions again without sort of having an angina attack, I will need to understand why it was I let it get under my skin so much. And that was partly about Brexit. It was partly about Jeremy Corbyn being leader of the Labour Party. It was about a combination of those things, which I would summarise as a feeling distinct from just, when you talked about someone on the centre-left feeling slightly alienated by politics, it was a feeling more profound than that of being exiled from politics, because I suddenly felt that the permission, almost the permission I'd had to feel that British democracy, British politics belonged to me in some way, was being withdrawn by the sheer toxicity of what was going on. And if I wanted to write about politics again, and I didn't know anything else to write about, couldn't write a column about cheese, but I wasn't even allowed to eat cheese, so I had to to stick with politics. Then I needed to do that diagnosis, and so yeah, I think that's a very long way of saying, yes, I think you're right, David, that it's a sort of a diagnostic process that was made necessary if I wanted to carry on doing what I do for a living.
I think there's something that needs to be explained here, because it will come as a surprise, I think, possibly to some people who are looking at a journalist who's written for several papers, but now for The Guardian, who has worked in other countries and so on, and who imagines that actually journalists don't really care what's going on as long as there's news. And after all, there's been loads of news. It's been going on for years and years and years and years. So why would it be that we would actually be affected by what the news was?
Yeah, I think it's an important distinction, because actually, I think for a long time I wasn't aware of that distinction at all. In the book, I talk about the kind of the problem of savviness in political journalism, which is this very arch knowing idea that somehow, the cognoscenti understand what politics really is, and therefore the people who are sort of overly emotionally engaged, or who somehow moralise about the outcome rather than analysing the process, are missing the point. And I think that's a sort of an idiom of political journalism that really fell apart. Well, I say most of all, I think it fell apart around sort of Trump and then also Boris Johnson as well. This idea that where if you're in the business of analysing what works, and then it turns out that the thing that's really effective as a campaign technique is having no moral boundaries, systematically lying, not recognising that there should be truth, not recognising that constitutional order matters for democracy. And well, one of your options then as a journalist is to say, well, that's very interesting, that's effective. So obviously, now we must adapt our model to the fact that this is the new way of doing politics. Or you can retain some kind of ethical judgment that although that's how that does work, it shouldn't work. But that should part, you and I both came from a sort of school of political reporting that meant, well, you're not in the business of should. You're in the business of who, what, when, where. Those are the rules. And I don't think political journalism has adapted to that yet. I don't think we've still yet worked out how to navigate that dilemma.
I wonder about this a little bit, because there's also the business of being in society while you observe society. It's what, in Yiddish is called a kibitzer, a participant observer. You observe, but you're still there. And I don't know about you, but I remember feeling in the week leading up to the Brexit vote, because actually a large part of me expected what we actually got, a feeling of dread. It's the only way I could, and it happened again the night that Trump was elected. And it's not because I didn't see that there were big stories being as a result, and we would all have, be gainfully employed. It's just that I thought they would be awful stories and awful things.
I think the word I had all throughout that time, and I remember discussing it with a friend actually, we would talk about the quease. Just that feeling, that sort of souring, nauseated feeling that the news would give you. And I hadn't had that, there are a couple of things that go into that. So one is, previously, obviously I'd voted for parties that had lost elections. That was a normal part of democracy. And again, if you're on the left, it tends to happen quite a lot. And there is a sort of an assumption that the way representative democracy works, the unspoken rule is, well, you lose, but you might get a chance in 4 or 5 years' time, and the quid pro quo is that the side that wins sort of doesn't then try and configure the rules or do things that completely banish the losing side from participation or from politics altogether, because everyone, it doesn't have to be necessarily articulated, but everyone sort of intuitively recognises that the wider apparatus of the democracy is the common enterprise that we're involved in. And this process of politics is mediating the different conflicting interests within that society, and there's a bit of give and flow, and crucially there's a bit of sort of frustration and deferred gratification built into that. Like, no one gets all of what they want all the time. And then what happened after 2016, because, and we could talk about what is exactly meant by this word, because I think it's sometimes misused, but I think Brexit was, in this way, crucially a nationalist proposition. And what that meant was that through the direct mandate of a referendum, you have a winning side that says, our proposition represents the collective will of the people, which, or in the case of Donald Trump and others, we know, which it can then be sort of incarnated in the charisma of an individual. And then if you're against that, you're somehow therefore disqualified, you're diminished so much as a citizen in a democracy that you not only can we disregard your point of view, but we can call you a traitor, a saboteur, a fifth columnist. And the kind of politics that, and you can win campaigns with that kind of politics because you can, well, that's clearly been demonstrated, but you can't govern with that kind of politics precisely because there is no unitary will of the people, and ultimately there are going to be hard, complicated choices, as turned out to be the case with Brexit. And the failure is then so fundamentally, the governing failure is so fundamentally built into that project, that nationalistic project, that you are automatically going to government is automatically going to be propelled ever deeper into hunting out the traitors and finding the scapegoats and finding people to blame. And so that, going back to the point about the dread, or what I call the quease, it's that feeling that someone is sort of running a nail underneath the seam where you're stitched onto the actual society and the democracy that you're in, and peeling away your entitlement to belong in that society. And that's a totally different sense of dread to just, the party I voted for lost an election. I think it's just qualitatively different. And that, I think, 2016 was a pivot for that. Now,
you could argue that in 2015, 2016 was not a great time for the centre-right, but it was a terrible, terrible time for the centre-left, as I've suggested, particularly in this country, because everything it thought it was good at, and maybe it had been very complacent, it discovered it was defeated over. And not only was it defeated, but it was blamed by everybody for everything that had gone wrong and given no kind of way back in. And how do you look back on the 2015-2016 period from the point of view of the responsibility that, if you like, Social Democrats felt they had, and the response that they made to that kind of defeat?
Yeah, I mean, another way of I think sort of what we're getting at here is this question of when you're standing, when it's sort of June the 24th, 2016, and you're standing in a smouldering crater where the way you thought politics ought to have gone naturally, is that void that you're standing in, is that crater what we used to call the centre ground of politics. And specifically with regard to the centre-left, I think there's a problem that really you can chase the origins of these things as far back as you like. Someone will say, well, it's August 1914 where it all went wrong, or, it's probably, did we mishandle the Reformation, and that's why. But no, I think realistically, the financial crisis was a massive part of this for all sorts of reasons. Partly just because it was a moment where trust in the political system was going to take a massive knock anyway, and then the remedy is you use public money to bail out the people who caused the crisis and immiserate the people who didn't. So that's a big problem. And then you then have this, the coalition government does austerity, which exacerbates the pain. But crucially, I think it matters a lot in the specifically, and that was true in lots of places around the world, but in the British context, it was particularly awkward, I think, because New Labour was, I mean, people would argue how left it was. I think it was a party that was centre-left. It was broadly social democratic in its tax and spend policies. So you had a party, the UK party of the left, presiding over what was very obviously a massive crisis of liberal capitalism. And then you have the party of the right in opposition that can't give an account of what went wrong that's consistent with their own values and beliefs as conservatives. So they went for this other argument, which was that actually the problem was excessive state spending, and the real problem was Gordon Brown ramping up too much debt. And then then you've got a terrible misdiagnosis problem. You then have a situation where clearly 2010 becomes this change election because Labour had been in power for long enough, and you've had these crises. You've also had the parliamentary expenses scandal, by the way, so everyone's working on the assumption that all MPs are just sort of helping themselves to public money to buy expensive lamps and duck islands and stuff. And what you get is this coalition government that is change in form and has a tremendous novelty value, and you had Cleggmania in the interim. Do you remember that? I mean, the Lib Dems got 40% were leading the polls at one point in that 2010 election. I'm aware you asked about 2015, but I think it's 2015. You can't have 2015 without understanding 2010 in that way. And you have this weird situation where the left have, particularly the sort of the radical, orthodox socialist left, thinks it's sucked up enough compromises with Thatcherism, thank you very much, plus the Iraq War, so can we now have something properly left, please? You've got the right that thinks, we've had enough new Labour-y, metropolitan, liberal leftism, bossiness telling us we can't smoke in pubs and smack our children. Can we have proper conservatism, please? You get David Cameron and Nick Clegg coming in. David Cameron gives a load of cabinet jobs to, women and Lib Dems, which the sort of people in blue blazers and gold buttons don't like, and he's called them fruitcakes, loonies, and closet racists. I mean, he was talking about UKIP, but they knew he was sort of talking about them as well. And the left gets Ed Miliband, which is sort of, what's that? To a lot of people who wanted proper socialism. So then by the time you get to 2015, you've had this interregnum after a change election where if at one point the centre ground or the centre left of New Labour at least had a credible claim to represent the mainstream of British politics, by 2015, it's this shriveled technocratic rump of people in the same identical dark blue suits, all men who went to the same university, mostly studied the same course, who had been special advisors, parachuted into safe seats. And from further out there, they all look the bloody same. And, and this comes back to your point about political journalism. Meanwhile, the lobby and political journalism is having a whale of a time. And I mean, I really enjoyed covering the coalition. This is just one of the biggest sort of mea culpas probably that I have to put in here, is that it was leaky as hell, and the Lib Dems loved leaking about the Tories to me because I was writing for The Guardian, and it was great, and I loved being an insider. I got that kind of taste of power. I know people. I've got Secretary of State's mobile numbers on my phone. This is, but you're running around Versailles reporting on the court without noticing that there's a revolution brewing behind your back. Did that? I don't know. But I feel I deviated, meandered away from your comment.
It's your prerogative to deviate, and so.
But yes, but in that sense, I think there was. I remember your question now. Yes, tremendous responsibility in that a lot of people became incredibly complacent over that period about, for example, whether you ought to and how you should make the case for Britain's participation in the European project.
I mean, I particularly found this because I found people who subsequently became very strong Remainers who it was almost impossible to convince in the period up to 2016 that this was Europe was an important and strategic element of Britain's position. I just found it impossible. They just didn't want to know.
It was incredibly boring. I remember in writing about, here's one for the real Euro nerds out there, and I know some of you online, as well as in the audience, but I know a couple specifically online who are watching this will get this. I remember writing about the opt back in from the opt out of the Justice and Home Affairs pillar of the Lisbon Treaty, and trying to explain to an editor at The Observer why this was an important thing. And by the time you'd even got 3 sentences into explaining what it was, rather than, let alone even why it mattered. There's no chance it wasn't getting anywhere near the paper. Yeah. And so, whereas, though we haven't got our sovereignty and our laws are made by bureaucrats and straight bananas, was a much more resonant story. And by the time it became clear that we would want to articulate basically a moral and strategic case for the European project, not only had the muscles that we might have used to make that argument atrophied from 30 years of not being used, but we were propelled into the campaign by a Prime Minister who configured it as a way of solving an internal dispute in the Conservative Party and fought the whole thing with one hand tied behind his back.
So it's lost, and at the same time, unexpectedly, Trump wins the 2016 election. Remember, this comes after 2 terms of Barack Obama and Let There Be Hope. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable if you can't, one way if you look back on it. Now, you've had a prefiguration of some of this in an odd kind of way, because before all this has happened, you've been in Russia, and you write about how it prefigures some of what you then see. So take us through that.
Well, yeah, so there's a section, there's sort of the second section of the book, actually. I take the narrative off to Russia, partly because the rule is write what you know, and I did spend a lot of time out there. But also, this was, again, this sort of diagnostic element of thinking, if I'm trying to just come up with a dispassionate, rational analysis of really how threatened is British democracy by what's been going on, am I being neurotic, paranoid, or is this a liberal whinge because I just don't like losing, and actually I'm getting overly hysterical about what's just a normal ebb and flow of politics, or is something more profound going on? I wanted to compare it to a situation where I had seen before my eyes a democracy completely fail, which was the one that they tried to introduce in Russia in the 90s. And obviously they're 2 completely different countries, 2 completely different histories and cultures. And so while I was there watching it happen, it was very easy for me to think, well, this is a right old mess. Blimey, you wouldn't want to do it like that. Luckily, back in the UK, the country that I come from, there are public servants who go into it with the highest of motives, and you have elections that actually count for something. And I would have conversations with my Russian friends where, if I said I was trying to understand what was going on in politics, they'd just laugh at me and say, well, you're a child, you'll never understand this. Basically, there's power and then there's you, and you have 2 options. You can either try and get your piece of power by paying bribes or just gaming the system, or you can be a dissident and go into sort of internal exile and nurture some kind of internal moral values separate from power. But the idea that you'd be engaged, participate in democracy, grow up. And I'd say, no, that's Russia, but understand, in the UK it's different. And say, you're even more of a child for thinking that. You've just got fancier scenery on your stage and maybe a more elaborate script, but it's the same play. And I really didn't think that was true, and I didn't want to think it was true. And I don't think it's true, but there was this moment where it was been up to 2017, 2018. I remember very, very clearly walking down Victoria Street, having got a train into Victoria, walking towards Parliament, probably having sat there on my phone on Twitter, having an argument with a robot about something very frantically, getting myself all wound up, getting my blood pressure up to 160 over 90 or whatever, and just having this Proustian moment of thinking, that's something terribly familiar. I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was, but as strong as a smell or a taste. And then just thinking, oh God, British politics tastes Russian somewhere. And it's hard to put my finger on what it was, but it's something caustic in the way that no one was actually engaging with the arguments people were making. Everyone was presuming that everything was in bad faith. The only reason anyone would go into politics would be completely venal. And also, in particular, and this is a subject that's close to your heart, I know, there's the sense that there was no distinction anymore, or a blurred distinction between political analysis and conspiracy theory. Because if everyone's joining the dots to try and find the real explanation, yes, you found where you think power is, but there's a secret corridor off the back of that room that leads you to another chamber, that leads you down some flight of stairs to another labyrinth, at the end of which there's a well down the bottom of which you'll still never find the real reason why what's going on. And that to me made me worry that there was a potential kind of Russification of the cynicism, the way we are, the hyper cynicism I call it, that just corrodes democracy from the roots.
Now, what's interesting about this is at precisely the same time, you have the explosion of social media. At more or less precisely the same time. You could argue that it begins slightly earlier than this period, and it does, but at its high point of explosion is roughly in the 2015-16 moment, and it happens in a way we haven't predicted.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's interesting now to think how little during the referendum campaign, for example, at the time, how little commentary there was on the effectiveness of Facebook targeting to people. So someone you could find with your exact postcode, find the exact message in the exact street that you live, the particular bit of the Leave prospectus that would most speak to you. And also, I think that was a time when now I think we take it for granted that part of the discourse around social media was, it's making people angry, it's polarizing, there might be fake news, there might be lies. That people still use it, but there is a sort of now an awareness that something that you've got this factory that's sort of churning information very quickly, and then you've got this horrible slurry thing coming out the back of it that's a bit poisonous, and it's someone's job to maybe worry about that and try and clean it up. But in 2016, that was really not. I mean, journalists were just obsessed with it all over it. No one was. Very, very few people were thinking, is this actually a problem, the way this is accelerating the discourse and not giving anyone a moment to reflect on how much of it is true, or not giving anyone sort of a time to distinguish what feels urgent because it's up in my face, as opposed to what feels important. And the classic example of this, in that referendum, sorry to keep going back to the referendum campaign, we should try and move on from that. Let's get over it. I'm not over it. The day that Tony Blair and John Major spoke in a university campus in Derry and stood up and said, by the way, if you leave the European Union, you're going to have a problem at the border, especially if you leave the single market, and this will undermine the Good Friday Agreement. And it led the news for about an hour and a half. It wasn't on the front page of a single newspaper the next morning. And what was? There was Nigel Farage in a fishing boat going up the Thames or something. But that was the socials drove that, I think.
Yeah, but what about the other aspect of it, which was we'd already had in America, because you could see it in the books that people bought, for example, the polarization and the siloization of politics, where people weren't speaking to each other or were finding confirmation in their own groups, and then we get something similar happening here.
Yeah, I'm always wary of the comparison with America because the polarization there feels so much more extreme, partly because, again, first of all, I think it's because the first wave culture wars in the US was so connected to the different experiences that people had had around Vietnam and the way that played through the Nixon years. And that's even setting aside civil rights in the late 60s. So 1968 as a year of polarization in the US is just its own thing that doesn't actually have a lot of resonance, a lot of relevance, I think, to the UK. And religious fervor is so much more a fundamental part of what forms the style and the content of American politics that we mercifully, I think, don't have here. What I do think is relevant, and this is in researching the book, something I found one of the bits that's most fascinating, which is the sort of psychology of polarization, which is this idea that there are some opinions that you hold that you sort of, as it were, on the surface of the analytical part of your brain. So you might think it's a better idea to tax one group of people over another. You might like, in theory, the idea of putting VAT on private school fees, or you might prefer the idea of national insurance rise, whatever. But that's just opinion. And then there are some beliefs that you have that become sort of fused to your sense of identity. And these, in the sort of jargon, these are your sacred beliefs. And it means that if someone challenges the idea, so the classic one in American politics, which is really, I think, useful because everyone in the UK can sort of get their heads around this, is gun laws. Because if you're a European, or most Europeans, self-evidently, it's insane that you can buy automatic weapons and ammunition in the supermarket. And obviously, if you stop people doing that, fewer people would get killed by guns. It doesn't seem to be terribly controversial. But if you have, over many decades, have internalized the idea that your Second Amendment privileges are central to what it means to be a free American and a patriot, then when you hear someone say, I want to reform gun regulation, what you hear is, I hate America. And then you put that, you realize, well, I mean, that's true probably for me as a Remainer, really. I mean, if I want to really stress test this proposition, like what would it take, actually, for me or for you or for anyone in this room to think, yeah, actually, on balance, maybe Brexit was a good idea. What would it really take? Because actually, that's not an opinion that I hold on that surface way. And so when someone attacks one or criticizes one of your sacred opinions, you feel it as a personal attack, and the natural response to being attacked is fear and anger, and then you're not going to engage in a proper conversation.
That raises an interesting question about what for people like us are sacred opinions, which fall into the category of sacredness. I mean, I find myself able most of the time journalistically to make a detachment when I have to. But there is one question I can't make a detachment for, which is the Rwanda deportations. I can't do it. My sense of morality is so essentially confounded by that policy that I cannot really admit into my kind of circle of trust, as that movie had, anybody who tries to argue with me that this is a good policy.
And well, I think that what you've hit on there is it really comes down to what for me was the hardest bit. The hardest bit literally just to write in terms of sitting there at the screen trying to tap out the sentences, thinking, what am I trying to articulate here? And I think I did it better in the book than I'm about to do it now because I had time to edit it and write it then. But which is exactly this dilemma that what do you do? And it's connected to the point you were making about the sort of post-2016 liberal self-flagellation moment of thinking, did we bring this on ourselves by neglecting all these people, by not understanding how many people felt left behind by globalization, by allowing a sort of arrogant, patronizing metropolitan view of them that thought, when they complained about the society having changed a lot and the immigration making them feel like they were strangers in their own country, the sense that they were then being told, shut up, you're a thick racist, move on. And then when they voted leave, being told, yeah, sorry, wrong answer, we're going to ask you again in a couple of years' time and you'll get the right answer. And that just made it worse. That, the challenge between on the one hand thinking, well, I have to, it's a necessary exercise in empathy, which is, okay, I can get why they got into the position of feeling the way they did and how that might lead to a situation where you are amenable to thinking, yeah, this Rwanda thing, that's what you've got to do, while also not going down, not crossing the boundary from empathy into appeasement, where you go, well, and therefore if enough people want to do that, that's what we got to do. And there is a point where I go, I don't care if enough people want to do it, it's just wrong. And for a long time, I think liberal Democrats haven't really had to try that hard to test that boundary between what if enough people wanted to do it anyway, and your principle is democracy, and therefore in that sense the will of the people still has to be. I don't know. I mean, so I think.
And that then comes into one of the things which we have always held dear. 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Nuremberg trials of 1945, etc. There is a supervening idea that you create legal processes and human rights legislation which take care of where that comes at its sharpest point, where majoritarianism may actually hit the rights of other individuals. And that has been under attack in the last 5 years in a way, ideologically, in a way I've never quite seen before.
Yeah, and I worry that, again, it's a bit like the thing about the sort of the muscles that defended or would have defended Britain's participation in the European project atrophied. And the two things are connected, obviously, because the European project, as conceived on a lot of the continent of Europe, was born out of that same ethos of never again. You bind the nations of Europe into a structure that will make the kind of nationalist bloodletting of the rest of European history not repeat itself. And, it is possible, or the fear that I've tried to address is that sense that actually what happened in that post-war moment is you amass a huge amount of moral capital behind a set of propositions, which is the ethos of never again, which is the literally the memory at the gates of Auschwitz, the memory of what happens when you let things slide into the abyss. And that gives rise to a set of structures and institutions, and then that decays. That moral imperative just fades and decays, and you think we've just been so thoroughly inoculated with the history that the antibodies are coursing through our veins, so we're immune, and then you get to 2016, and you have Donald Trump, essentially a fascist, just luckily not a very competent one, wins a presidential election, and you think, well, where was our inoculation? And how did we manage to watch someone be so glib? He wasn't even a wolf in sheep's clothing. I mean, there was a wolf in wolf's clothing, and all the savvy journalists were going, that's clever how he actually does the wolf thing, but that's just freaking people out. That's gaming the kind of liberal, sort of offending liberal opinion to get CNN to report it more, and isn't that clever? But without thinking, well, I don't care if it's clever or not, there's still fascism.
Just time before we go to questions to think about how you conclude this, because especially what we've just been talking about, would be quite enough stuff to give us another heart attack. And yet,
so I've got a couple of stents in now, so yeah, I can do it now.
Yeah. Okay, there are other arteries are available. If you think you've only got two,
I know.
Anyway, unkind of me to mention that, really. But actually, the book's not unoptimistic because it's written in the hope that you can help people navigate and help yourself navigate a way through. And I promise you, there's not a word of Zen stuff in it. It's not about kind of going into a dark room and practicing Anthony Seldon type mindfulness and so on. Excellent, though, I'm sure that is. Tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll ask for some.
Yeah, I was determined to be optimistic, not in a sort of Pollyanna-ish, it'll all be fine, and also there's a trick that you can do to be optimistic, which is to zoom the lens of history out far enough. That means that the arc tends to bend, viewed from enough of a distance, the arc does bend towards progress, because if you were. The thought experiment is if you had to be born, you could choose to be born at some random point in the past, but you don't know where or in what kind of family or what sex or gender you'll be, or just be born tomorrow. Easily the safest thing is tomorrow by a massive margin, because you've got a much better chance of literally surviving childbirth, surviving the first 5 years, not being killed by war, famine, pestilence. So progress exists, but the danger is then if you zoom out too far like that, you sort of missed a lot of the suffering in the folds and the contours. And what I was trying to get right, because I'd had that moment of fearing, especially remember that around the prorogation of Parliament and all these things that were where you felt the institutions of democracy were really creaking and the boards were shaking underneath us. Like thinking, we haven't really tested how deep that abyss is yet. We don't really know, and history says it goes very, very far. And so I'm trying to understand, okay, so is it messy and a bit unsteady in a kind of mid-70s, no one's collecting the bins kind of way, or is it messy and unsteady in a August 1914 kind of way? And it's quite important to be able to sort of do that parallax thing where you understand.
I love that, because it just shows that you're slightly younger than me. So you can't remember that in the 70s they got very worried about there being a right-wing coup.
Well,
one or two of you may be old enough to to recall this. We've got to ask some questions, Rafael. My final question to you is, will you be here signing books at the end of this session?
I very much will, with enormous pleasure.
Okay, that's right, so he will be. Right, now, the first question we have, I can't actually see you, so I haven't asked whether I can now. Hi, you can see us. So before I come to, there are two questions I can already see. I'm going to, that says, hello and welcome to the Guardian Live event. I'm David, no, here they are. So, these are advanced questions that are in this one. Rosalind asks, and thank you, Rosalind. In view of the stranglehold exerted by the right-wing press, how can you make the general public aware of the extent to which standards in public and political life have fallen?
I I think, again, the thing with the right-wing press is an interesting example of something that can feel as if it's got worse while also getting smaller. So I think when you think about some of the hysterical frenzy, the ferocity and the sheer derangement that you see now, you mentioned the Rwanda stuff, some of the way that's reported, is almost more effective at animating the horror in the people who are appalled by it than it really is in proselytizing beyond the people who already agree with that. And it can still be possible that there are fewer of them now than there were even 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, and so, actually we were talking about this backstage a minute ago. I think it's one of the very interesting things when the things will happen if the Conservatives go into opposition, which I think they probably will, and they embrace the sort of betrayal myth and they start to say, sort of coalesce around the position of Brexit was absolutely perfect, and the reason it hasn't worked is because the blob and the liberal Remainers and helped by foreigners made it go wrong. And they embrace sort of national conservatism, which is at most a sort of 15-20% proposition in this country, I'm sure. Will the sort of wider conservative media and cultural ecosystem that has sustained the Tories in government follow them down that path and just make themselves that bit less relevant and more marginal? Will they, as they did actually in the late 90s and early noughties, start shuffling back towards the centre and go, well, look, those guys have got a bit freaky and weird, we don't want to be part of that? Or will they actually be sufficiently effective as a propagandising instrument that they can turn this slightly weird, mad, nationalist minority position into something more potent than it really is? And I think we have to hold our nerve and be confident that it isn't a majority position. And bluntly, there are more of us than there are of them.
And thinking about it, that conversation we had earlier, it probably depends on whether we hit another major crisis under a new government or not. There's a gentleman down here, I think. Hey, you have the microphone.
Hello.
Hi.
Good evening. Thanks for coming. I want to go back to the question and just repeat the one you asked, because we heard the reasons not to be fakely optimistic. What are the reasons to be genuinely optimistic?
Okay, thank you for reminding me. Good question. So one, I think the kids are all right. I've got a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old daughter, and their generation, not only are they generally, and their friends, this has come up every event I've done a lot of events actually around the book and before, and the question comes up, and I say this, and there's always people nodding in the audience, and because actually they care passionately about the climate. They are so much kinder than we were at their age. And there is a healthy skepticism about the kind of fanatical polarization that we were talking about. That is, I think, actually, that has peaked generationally as an artifact of the first wave of internet, sort of as almost a sort of a naive early engagement with social media and the internet, up to a point. I wouldn't overstate it, but that gives me reason to optimism. The other one, a couple actually. First of all, it's easy to configure worst case scenarios because you can sort of plot a few lines of things going wrong, and then you just extrapolate the curve, and it takes you to, 1939. It's quite easy to draw that kind of line. But actually, it's just as possible that good things happen as bad, and historically, okay things do happen. Let's get an example now. So, look, I think it's appalling that Boris Johnson never became Prime Minister, and I think the process, the very fact that someone like that managed to was deemed qualified and even got the job says something of the systemic problems that we have in this country. But also, he's not Prime Minister because he was a pathological liar, and an independent press exposed him for being a pathological liar. And then his own party, for all their many flaws, thought, okay, this guy is a liability, we've got to get rid of him. And now he's not even going to be an MP anymore. I wouldn't overstate saying the system works, but nor would I think we shouldn't underestimate the fact that, well, things are way better now than they were 2 years ago. And then the third thing I would say in regard to the pandemic, which I think is very important, is, what is the big arc story that happened in that pandemic, which was a terrible time for a lot of people. I'm not belittling the suffering that happened, but at the start of that process, if you go back to January 2020, there was a feeling that there was no truth no basis of fact. Everything was just a shifting bog, and the most charismatic, mad personality could just name their own truth, and everyone would have to go along with it. And at least in this country, then what happened was a pathogen came along, and within 9 months, we'd identified it and found a vaccine for it and got it into people. And
it was international.
And that was facts and science. Did that truth, an actual objective material truth that plenty of mad people tried to say wasn't there, and they're still out there, but they didn't win. And so I do think have a bit more confidence in the fact that there is a truth and it does endure. The lies are faster, but it's a kind of a tortoise and hare thing. I think the truth wins.
It's a good point, this, and it takes us on to the next question here that's been just been called in, which is, we spend an awful lot of time now talking about the people who scare us, which may very well take us away a little bit from what the opportunities may be and what the future may hold. So Neil asks, what kind of Prime Minister would Keir Starmer make?
I think that's a big question. Okay, the cheating answer is it depends how big his majority is, and who the MPs are that can limit his thing. Look, okay, here's my feeling about Keir Starmer. I think he is obviously, to my eyes, a better, more qualified, professional person with decent democratic values than anyone who's been Prime Minister, any of the many people who have been Prime Minister in the last 2 years. And although I don't necessarily agree with everything that he's done and the way he's done it, what has impressed me about him is that he is building the plane while flying it, and having basically come into relatively new to politics, relatively new MP, seems to be looking at the evidence and working out, how do I win, and how do I win in a way that will enable me to have a mandate to govern enough. My concern is that in that process, he's not clear enough about his own sacred values, going back to that time, what his own real core beliefs are, that he could end up really getting buffeted by events, that there won't be a kind of a clear through line what it is he's actually intending to do. Just sort of being a more honest, fresh-faced, technocratic, social democratic Rishi Sunak is not going to be enough. And this really comes up to, brings back to the question that I think a lot of people worry about with Keir Starmer, which is about why can't he articulate the fact that there's a problem with Brexit. I think that is emblematic of something that is both sort of a strength and a weakness at the same time. I think he probably recognises at some level that a more capable, charismatic politician could probably shift the dial on that more and make a virtue of saying, let's face it, guys, this was a bit of a disaster. But also that he might not be that guy, and the position he's got on that might be the best one that's available to him.
You mean, in other words, the thing that terrifies her about it is having the label successfully stuck on him that he will reopen the divisions of the referendum campaign. So he feels he has to close that off, even though he knows that getting much closer to Europe, and as close to Europe actually as you could get, is in Britain's long-term strategic interests.
Yeah, let's be clear about it. What's the problem? The problem is you've got, you want to try and rebuild relations with the European Union, and you've got a ladder with a lot of very low rungs very close together, like SPS agreements on agricultural imports, cyto and phytosanitary materials, and Galileo and maybe a bit of Erasmus. Those are nice things to have, but they don't make a big difference. Those are, in terms of the state of the country. Then you've got a huge gap with no rungs at all, and then you've got customs union and single market and rejoin. And as soon as you get up there to those bits, then you really are reopening. Aren't you talking about the single market means basically open door immigration as configured by your enemies? And so there probably is a way to frame it completely differently about saying, well, look, what we want to do is, if we're going to be realistic about growing the economy and opportunities, we need to set a trajectory towards a better relationship with our neighbours and make all these arguments in a way that doesn't force you to say, well, either I'm just playing around on these low rungs here or I'm just going to shoot for the top rungs. I think that to pull that off as a bit of political framing takes a level of political talent that I don't think Keir Starmer has, frankly.
Okay. Gentleman over here.
Hi. I'll start with an observation, if I may, prompted by something you mentioned. I've just come back from a very enjoyable weekend in my hometown of Belfast, where I'm happy to say that the vibe these days is in welcome contrast to my upbringing in the 1970s, where we were a population transfixed by the news, for a start, and also struggling to maintain a semblance of normal life against a background of curtailment of civil liberties and the failure of local democracy. And I think one of the lessons of Northern Ireland for Brexit and its consequences is that we tend to have a feeling in the UK that, well, in England, bad things don't happen here because, well, we're English. And I think the lesson of Northern Ireland is that bad things can and do happen here. And that the events of the last 8 years, or 7 or 8 years since Brexit, have left us with a grossly degraded polity in this country. And if there's a question at the end of this, it's how do we recover the integrity of our institutions, and just as importantly, public faith in those institutions?
Yeah, I mean, if I could...
Brackets, what do we do about the honour system?
Yeah, that's easy, I'd scrap that. I mean, if there's a way of sort of clicking the agree like button on hard enough that it sort of broke the computer screen on that point about, particularly with regard to Northern Ireland, and a kind of parochial, and you're absolutely right to say English idea of the apparatus of the Mother of Parliaments and this sort of narration that goes back to sort of general line of continuity 1066 onwards, and just skipping out that bit in the 17th century where we had wars of religion and we beheaded the king, all that. There's just there is such a strong sense in particularly English conservative folklore that makes us think that democracy is in our DNA in such a fundamental way that it's okay for the Prime Minister to dissolve Parliament because he just doesn't like what he's saying. And that's not an authoritarian act. That's just a bit of constitutional dressing up box playing with the crown, but it's all fine. The fact, I won't get sidetracked actually on the specific question of Northern Ireland, but I think you're absolutely right to identify that as emblematic of that. And Boris Johnson was the incarnation of this, because I think in many ways, that you probably might have come across this Peter Hennessy idea of the good chaps theory of government. This idea that for a long time, it's something Gladstone had pointed to in the late 19th century as well. This idea that actually the system works because a certain type of person bred in a certain type of institution, certain type of school, has such an intuitive sense of what's decent and right that is the constitution there carried by these people. And if you wanted to sort of genetically engineer something to stress test that proposition, he would be Boris Johnson, because he has all the external manifestations of the good chap, and he went to Eton and he went to Oxford, and every part of it, except it was a values void at its heart, just pure narcissism in the middle of it. Now, so that raises the question, which is I think what's really interesting here, is how much of it is institutions and how much of it is culture? Because my first thing I reach for is, well, we just now need a written constitution, right? And we probably need electoral reform, and we should get rid of the Lords, and I would like separation of the powers. There's all these things I could dream up in my head as like a better constitutional settlement. But then you remember that, the Soviet Constitution of 1936 had, rights of assembly.
Great constitution.
It's all, North Korea has a constitution, so it's not enough. And so then I think, which is the nub of your question, really, is if the cultural presumptions and the protocols have broken down, you can't just stick new constitution on top of that and hope that those, it's like if you raise the water temperature around the coral reef hot enough, all the little fine tendrils of seaweed that nurture little fish die, and you've still got a constitutional lump of coral, but it's bleached white. There's no constitution, there's no sort of civic life around it. So how do we cultivate that? And that, I think the answer has to be local. I think that is really where you talk about, you need to reweave connections between people and a sense of solidarity based on available units of solidarity, which for the time being now I think is going to be more local. If you want strangers to really be in the business of, for example, paying tax to help each other's grandmothers, probably you want to localise.
Finally, Canada, and you haven't got much time to answer this.
Oh, sorry, I do back.
Canada, no, that's fine.
The book's much more efficient,
It's your show.
by the way.
Canada wants to know whether we can get rid of first past the post, whether we ever will.
It's a great catch-22, isn't it? Because any party that can win power under first past the post immediately loses their incentive to get rid of first past the post. And there's a separate reason why I think Keir Starmer won't do it or doesn't want to do it, and how much of this is in his head and how much of this is part of the wider apparatus of people around him who are effectively. I mean, I don't believe in this idea that it's always the Tsar's wicked ministers who fill a leader's head with bad ideas. The leader is the leader, but there is a kind of tribalism in the Labour Party that is so strong that even if Labour have 305 seats at the next election and the Lib Dems could give them a solid majority, that feeling that the Lib Dems are just sort of the yellow peril who got lost on the way to the Labour Party and should just shut up and fold in behind us is so strong. And also the fear that the thing about first past the post is we have coalition politics at the moment, right? So one of the arguments against PR is, will you get messy coalition politics? Well, first of all, or that you might let extremists in to the mainstream. Well, those ships have clearly sailed because you've got a Conservative Party that has become hijacked by nativist nationalism, and we've had nothing but chaos for years now, under first past the post, even with an 80-seat Tory majority. But the coalition politics is submerged within parties. So the Tories are a coalition of the old sort of Cameron and earlier liberal pro-business Conservative Party and the Farageist Brexit Party, crudely speaking. And the Labour Party is still a coalition between a centre-left, liberal, Blairish party and a more orthodox socialist party. And then you can argue about how much there's sort of social democrats in the soft left in the middle. But anyway, it doesn't take long under proportional representation for those factions to think, well, we don't need to stick around with these losers, let's have our own party. And they can still be an effective force. They don't have to stick with their awful siblings. It's like, politics doesn't have to be like the awful Christmas dinner where you have to sit there with your mad uncle going, God, okay. You can just do your own thing. And that splits...
Yeah, he's next door.
Yeah, but that splits the Labour Party very quickly under PR, and so Labour leadership will not want to do that. But I think, ultimately, again, and I do support PR, I think it is just undeniable that every time the British public have been given an opportunity to vote in an election where it matters and a party that isn't Labour or Tories is on the ballot, those parties do really well. I mean, that's why the SNP ended up running Scotland. That's why the Brexit Party came first in the 2019 European Parliament. That's why the Greens had a massive surge in European elections. Every time you give them a chance, British people go, can we have something that's not Labour or Tory, please? So eventually I think that's going to express itself.
Yeah. Personally, what I'd do if I was Keir Starmer and Labour Party is I would legislate without a referendum for a change to a form of ATV which wasn't the one which was voted on in 2011.
We go very nerdy. STV with multi-member constituencies.
And I would just do it.
There's an electoral system.
Yeah, we never voted on that. Exactly, go for that. That's all we have time for. Rafael will be signing books afterwards. My big thanks to the organisers and to the people who've done the sound, etc. Absolutely brilliantly done, flawless, despite the fact that you had problems earlier. No one could have told, so thank you very much indeed for that. Very many thanks from the two of us for the questions. They were great, absolutely right. We only predicted 2 of them. And more than anything else, many thanks to Rafael for writing this book and coming and talking to us.
Well, thank you, David, for hearing.
You've got to go through time,